In 1991, Virgin Publishing released the first 4 novels in the New Adventures series. These continue the story of the Doctor and Ace following the show's cancellation in 1989. The range continued until 1997 with 61 books released in total. I'm planning to eventually review all of these on this channel in batches, but I'm starting with the first 4 books, which all make up a linked series featuring the evil Timewyrm. First is Timewyrm Genesys by John Peel, not the Radio 1 DJ. Sadly, this is not a good book, relying on lots of continuity references to please the fans, and taking the freedom to tell a more adult story a bit too far. It's a poor start to the range, but thankfully it gets much better very quickly. The freedom to go beyond what the TV show could is immediately established, as Ace starts the novel stark naked, and the male writer spends a lot of time with her describing her naked body in the mirror and then putting on her underwear. It all feels rather gratuitous, and you can't help wondering what Sophie Aldred thought of it. The justification for this scene is that Ace has lost her memories, thanks to the Doctor messing with the TARDIS telepathic circuits. And once she is dressed, the Doctor has to explain to her who they are and everything about the TARDIS. I guess it's an easy way of introducing the concept and the characters to new readers, but I don't know how many people would be reading this who haven't seen the show it's based on. If anything, the book is aimed more at the long-term fans, as evidenced by the 4th Doctor making a cameo appearance to warn them of the Timewyrm. A lot of new adventures casually bring back old Doctors and companions. It's a lot easier when you don't have to worry about getting the actors back. This also has a scene where the 3rd Doctor takes over the 7th Doctor's body at the end, complete with all his familiar mannerisms. As someone who's just watched the entire classic series, these scenes do work well, and the writer seems much more comfortable with these earlier Doctors than with the one that he's been contracted to write a whole book about. The actual plot has the Doctor and Ace travel to ancient Mesopotamia in 2700 BC, where they fall in with legendary hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. He was a legendary figure in mythology, but here he's portrayed as a barbarian thug, interested only in fighting and fornicating. Nothing explicit is shown, but he is depicted as fondling and groping both women and teenage girls. Ace is understandably revolted by him, but the Doctor insists it's all perfectly normal for the time and he shouldn't be judged by modern standards. This feels very out of character. The Doctor is never afraid to call out bad behaviour in any era, and forcing her to spend time with this brute just feels really callous of him. Uruk is at war with the neighbouring city of Kish, which has been taken over by the villain Ishtar. She claims to be a goddess, but is actually a cybernetic alien, who feeds off intelligent life and can control people's minds through implants. There are some disturbing scenes of her doing this. It's a lot easier to convey the horrors of mind control in prose, rather than on screen where you have to rely on the actors. And you can certainly see how she's a big enough threat that it takes 3 more books to stop her. There is very little jeopardy for most of the book. The protagonists don't come anywhere near Ishtar until nearly the end, and most of it just feels like they're treading water until then. There is a decent sequence where Ace and Gilgamesh travel to meet Utnapishtim, the leader of Ishtar's original race, which has kind of a fancy quest feel, and there are some atmospheric descriptions of the spaceship, suggesting historical fiction may not be the writer's strong point. Eventually, the Doctor and Ace confront Ishtar, but their attempts to stop her result in her merging with the TARDIS and becoming the evil Timewyrm, a malevolent entity capable of travelling through all of time and space. This is when you realise the whole book was all about setting up the larger story arc and is not remotely complete in itself. And there isn't even a decent cliffhanger, just the TARDIS landing in London in the rain. As to the regular characters, Ace's characterisation works well once her memory finally returns. She's clearly the same feisty teen, loyal to the Doctor, but not afraid to go against him when necessary. The Doctor spends rather too much time thinking about his dead companions and trying to prevent Ace from meeting the same fate, which again feels wrong. He barely knew Katrina or Sarah Kingdom, and they're referenced repeatedly, possibly because they're on the list of official companions. Overall, it's not a great start to the range, but fortunately it does get better. Next up is Timewyrm Exodus by Terrance. My generation grew up reading his Target novelisations, which were simple and easy reads aimed at a younger audience. The new adventures were intended to be much more experimental and complex, but Dix ended up writing 3 of them. And judging by this one, he managed the transition just fine. The writing style is certainly very straightforward, but there's nothing wrong with that. And the subject matter is noticeably more adult than the classic Who novelisations would have allowed, while nowhere near the excesses of the preceding book in the series. It's a solid read, and proves that Dix could write a good Doctor Who story, whatever the target audience. The story can be broadly divided into 2 parts. The first half is based on an alternate version of Britain in 1951, under German occupation, having lost the Second World War. It's broadly similar to the real occupied France, with the population split between collaborators and resistance members, although with the added wrinkle that all the able-bodied men have been shipped out to work as slaves. There are not many actual Nazis to be seen. Most of the bad guys are members of the Free Corps, here made up of all the nasty far-right bully boys, relishing in the chance to bully anyone weaker than themselves. The worst of these is Lieutenant Hemmings, a complete sadist who bashes Ace around for the fun of it. He's a truly vile character, and he does end up coming back later. The Doctor gets through this by impersonating a Nazi official, and he spends a lot of time throwing his weight around and barking orders. It doesn't feel entirely right for this Doctor. You can imagine the third or sixth doing something similar, but the seventh mostly likes to keep to the shadows. Ace is understandably alarmed by this, wanting nothing to do with the Nazis. She comes across as very young here, constantly calling the Doctor Professor and messing around with explosives. You don't get the feeling that Dix is massively familiar with her character, or indeed any women, as there are very few of them in the book. This setting could easily have been expanded to fill the whole novel, but instead the second half has the Doctor going back to try and find out how and why history was changed in the first place. It's a much more forensic approach to time travel than we ever got in the classic series, where the Doctor could barely control the TARDIS at the best of times. So this kind of anticipates the new series where you can zip between time zones with ease. The remainder of the book is based much more on actual history, as the Doctor goes back to Berlin in 1923 and then Nuremberg in 1939 to try and put history on the right path again. Dix has clearly done his research, it all feels very authentic, and he seems to be relishing the opportunity to show off his knowledge of history. The Timewyrm herself is oddly silent in this volume, trapped in the mind of Adolf Hitler throughout. It is implied that her influence is what gave him such power over crowds and enabled his rise to power in the first place, but this seems rather unnecessary. History has proven time and time again troubled people can trick the public into voting for them just by appealing to their baser instincts. No alien influence is required. The real villains turn out to be the warlords from the War Games, specifically the War Chief, who is cleverly disguised as Dr. Kriegsleiter, which is basically the German translation of War Chief. It's they who are using the Timewyrm-possessed Hitler to win the Second World War. A lot of new adventures bring back obscure villains from the series past. This is one of the more successful entries, as Dix created these characters in the first place, so they do feel authentic. Real Nazis are also heavily involved. Apart from the Hitler scenes, we get cameos from Martin Bormann and Albert Speer. Goebbels tries to chat up Ace but doesn't get anywhere, while the rivalry between Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler gets the most prominence. Goering is oddly sympathetic throughout, coming across as the best of a bad bunch, while Himmler is just as evil as you might expect. I guess portraying all Nazis the same would have been a bit simplistic, but it still feels a bit odd rooting for Goering to save the day. Ace in this section is treated even more like a generic companion, screaming and fainting when captured by the warlords and almost getting ritually sacrificed. This does lead into a fun action scene with zombie Nazis and a nuclear reactor blowing up, taking full advantage of the unlimited budget afforded by the print medium and providing an action-packed climax. Overall, it's a lot more ambitious in scope and subject matter than Dix's earlier books. There is no sex but plenty of violence, and the oppression of the Nazi regime comes through overwhelmingly in both periods depicted. The time-hopping structure keeps things interesting, although the first part could have used more room for development. The Timewyrm being only a secondary villain is certainly a surprise, though it may indicate the first draft only had the warlords and the Timewyrm was added later to fit into the story arc. At least it ensures there isn't too much repetition from the first volume. In fact, you could probably skip that one and just start on this one without missing too much of importance. Next is Timewyrm Apocalypse by Nigel Robinson. This is probably the least essential of these 4 novels. It's really just a standard Doctor Who adventure, and the Timewyrm only comes in at the very end. This takes place on the planet Kirith, several billion years in the future, at the end of the universe. It seems like a paradise the inhabitants want for nothing, but of course there is a dark secret. The Pangistri who rule over them are using them for genetic experiments, and there are some disturbing scenes, such as when we learn that all the Kirithmen's food is made up of the remains of their own dead, Soylent Green style. There is a monster, the Homunculus, which is a grotesque composite of body parts left over from all the Pangistri experiments. It's not around for long, but it's certainly disturbing to read about. What it all boils down to is really just a standard story of the Doctor convincing an enslaved populace to rise up against their oppressors. The fact that they don't realise they're enslaved means it takes longer than usual, and the novel format means it can play out on a larger scale. Still, the story beats are predictable, and the ending is never nearly out. The characters are nothing special either. Raphael probably gets the most development. He's the first of the Kirithans to encounter the Doctor and Ace, and he becomes another one of Ace's near love interests, until the ending when he inevitably meets the same fate as all men who fall for her. For once, it's not really the Doctor's fault, so she won't be leaving the series just yet. As for the Timewyrm, there is virtually no mention of her until near the end, where we find out that she had been possessing the Grand Matriarch of the Pendistry the whole time, and was using their experiments to create a god machine that would give her absolute power over the entire universe. Nothing about this really relies on her being the Timewyrm. She could easily just have been a regular megalomaniac without changing anything. And she gets away in the end, ready for the final battle in the next book. One interesting aspect is the appearance of the second Doctor. There are frequent scenes where the Doctor finds himself flashing back to his earlier self, culminating in a fun scene where he meets a psychic projection or his second incarnation who tells him off for being so manipulative. Aside from the fact that he isn't really particularly scheming in this book, it's a good scene and lets you imagine the two characters interacting as they never got to do on screen. Overall, though, it's probably the weakest one of these so far. Finally, we have Timewyrm Revelation. This was the first published novel by Paul Cornell, who went on to be one of my favourite Doctor Who writers. This is not one of his best works, though. It starts and ends very strongly, but the whole middle section is rather self-indulgent, with far too much time spent in the surreal dream world. Still, it's full of wild ideas and innovative prose, and it shows a lot of potential for the future. His next few novels turn out to be much more consistent. The book starts with a bang, with an audacious prologue that seems designed to shatter as many taboos as possible. First, we get a glimpse into the Doctor's early life, describing his studies at the Academy, and his visits to the old hermit that he talked about in The Time Monster. This was long before the TV series dared to explore such territory, so it feels very much ahead of its time. Then we see Ace's childhood, where her younger self is being bullied by an evil little sod called Chad Boyle. These scenes are disturbingly realistic. Cornell would later write of his own experiences being bullied in his excellent novel Chalk. Shockingly, Boyle actually kills her, and is spirited away by the Doctor before he can face justice. It's an excellent opener, leaving the reader wondering what the hell is going on. The present-day storyline resumes after this, with the Doctor and Ace still hunting down the Timewyrm. Ace here is said to be in her early 20s, and feels much more mature than in the last three novels. It's a relief the character has been allowed to finally grow up a bit. The Doctor is described as being distant and aloof at the start, engaged in his own complex schemes without telling his companion anything, which is how he's often portrayed throughout this whole series. They visit the peaceful English village of Cheldon Boniface, but this turns out to be a trap set by the Timewyrm, and they're really on the moon. Ace is attacked by Boyle in a child-sized spacesuit, seemingly dies, and is sent to hell. This is the point where the book takes an unfortunate turn for the surreal, as we get endless chapters of Ace and the Doctor fighting their way through a bizarre succession of nightmares, haunted by images from their pasts. Their bodies are still in the real world, so none of this feels like it matters, even though you get the usual caveat of if you die here, your real body also dies, which never feels very convincing. A few chapters of this might have been fine, but this feels like it goes on for over half the book, which is just ridiculous. That being said, there are still some noteworthy sequences that stand out. The Doctor is forced to confront his guilt at the death of his past companions, with Adric, Katrina and Sarah Kingdom all appearing to him, even though he barely knew two of them. Several past Doctors also appear, similar to how in Power of the Doctor they came back as mental echoes of themselves. It's not quite the same, as here they represent different parts of the Doctor's psyche, with the Fifth Doctor acting as his conscience, tied to a tree and tortured, so the Seventh Doctor can carry on manipulating people without worrying about the cost. He is freed at the end, making the Doctor much warmer than usual, although it does not last. Ace is also made to face her past choices, a particularly strong part as her living a day as a normal teenage girl, obsessed with boys and fashion. The real Ace is still in there, buried deep beneath this shallow facade, only managing to come to the surface when she witnesses racist bullying and refuses to be part of it, which feels very true to her character. As a break from the dream world, a further storyline takes place in a grounded real-world setting, which is a sentient church on the moon. Cornell's interest in religious matters comes through here. The vicar is a sympathetic character, whose church just so happens to be inhabited by a disembodied alien of unclear origins called Saul. It's a concept reminiscent of Danny the Street from Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol comics, but with its own distinct spin, and Saul is a fascinating character, whether you believe him to be alien or divine. The Timewyrm herself is much more of a presence here than in the previous two novels. Here she is in control of the otherworldly dimension where Ace and the Doctor spend much of the book, and she lords it over them like a malevolent goddess. It does feel like we get a satisfying conclusion to the story that began in Genesys, although it's hard to tell how much Cornell had read of the middle two installments. Apocalypse is barely mentioned, but Hemmings from Exodus does appear quite briefly. He feels a bit wasted here. Boyle is more of an antagonist throughout. He does have more of a connection to Ace, but Hemmings was a much more complex character and would have made a worthier foe. Despite my reservations about some parts, the ending is still very satisfying. The Doctor and Ace have confronted their inner demons and come through much stronger than before, and the Timewyrm is finally taken care of with compassion rather than malice. It's a very warm and upbeat conclusion, leaving you feeling much more positive about the entire book, which is a neat trick. Overall, though, it's a frustrating read, very close to brilliance, but dragged down by the middle section, which just didn't work for me, and I really wish it did. So the next batch of new adventures I'll be covering here will be the Cat's Cradle trilogy. I don't remember there being much of a link between the three books, but I think the first one has some solid Gallifreyan lore, and the middle one is a decent near-future thriller. I don't remember much about the third one, but we'll see. If you want to read these reviews early, then you can join my Patreon, which is where I post them first. I was originally aiming to review one book every month, but now it's more like every 2 months. But of course, the more people who sign up, the more incentive I will have to get them done sooner. The Timewyrm reviews are up there for everyone to read, but I'll probably put the next batch behind a paywall, so if you want to read them, well, you know what to do. Next week on this channel, I'll be reviewing the first Doctor Who episode from 2006, New Earth. So join me for that, and I'll see you next time.